Well, it's good to be here. I've come to your school many times over quite a few years, and you've not heard me before, so that's good. I hope that what we're going to look at is useful. Not everything will be as simple as everything else, but I will try to keep it as simple as possible because you're not benefiting from Dutch translation. But all the slides are in Dutch. Almost all the slides are in Dutch. The organisation I represent is Creation Ministries International, and if you want to find out more about that organisation, there's a website called creation.com. I'll give you a bit more information at the end. Well, I'm going to talk about whether evolution is a fact or it's a belief. Is evolution something that is completely supported by scientific evidence, or is it something which is not very well supported by scientific evidence? What do you think? And what has it got to do with people who have faith in the Bible? Well, there are many opinions. Some people say evolution is a theory, but it's been quite well established and we're just working out a few details, but we're quite sure it happened. When I say evolution, I mean not the little changes that we all agree happen over time. You can see many different sorts of dogs have come from a dog ancestor. Dogs are breeding dogs, but there are many wild dogs and many domestic breeds of dogs, and I believe that they are all probably descended from something like a wolf. But that's not the kind of evolution that most people are thinking about. Why do I think that they're descended from a wolf? Because they have the same DNA, exactly. You can breed dogs, domestic dogs, with wolves. But when people say human beings and dogs have a common ancestor, if you go back in time, we're related to dogs and to trees and to fish and to bacteria. That's a very different belief in evolution. I don't believe that kind of evolution. And that's what Charles Darwin was teaching about. He taught not just about the small changes, but he taught that everything was related if you go back in time many millions of years. I believe that is a belief which is not supported by science. Some people would say evolution has many problems. I used to believe evolution was a very likely point of view. I used to believe evolution of everything from simple beginnings. As a Christian, I believed that as a person who believed the Bible to be the Word of God. But I was not applying the Bible in a consistent way. When I went to university at age 19, I had become an evolutionist. I grew up in a Christian home to believe what the Bible taught, and at age 17 I changed my mind, and I went to university 2 years later thinking God used evolution somehow to make everything. Of course, if you read Genesis, the first chapters of the Bible, it doesn't sound like evolution. It's completely different. Well, let me ask you a question about evolution. What do you know about evolution? Have you learnt anything about it? If I asked an audience of serious scientists what they knew about evolution for certain, it would be interesting to see what they would say. Many years ago, in Chicago, in the United States, someone asked this very question. In that room were hundreds of the world's leading scientists who believed evolution. And do you know what happened when someone asked this question? There was silence. And eventually, someone stood up and said this: I know one thing for sure, evolution should not be taught as a fact in our schools. These weren't Christian schools, these were the state schools. Did these people not believe evolution? Yes, they believed it, but they knew that it wasn't based on hard science. They knew there was a lot of problems with the details. This is an interesting statement which you always read in higher level biology books. I've seen this many times. Don't worry about the man's name, but he was a very famous biologist in the 20th century. And that's what he said. You read it for yourself, because I can't read the Dutch. But he said this, and many people believe it today. So many people believe it today that some would say you shouldn't allow a student to go to university to study biology or to study medicine if they don't believe evolution, because they will be bad biologists and bad doctors. That's untrue, but that's what some people believe. We should question these things. And I hope that you'll not mind reading a few statements from other people. Charles Darwin was more honest. He admitted problems. He was more honest than lots of people are today. Yes, he made the theory popular with his book in 1859, but listen to what he says. Often I have had my doubts. Often I've wondered whether my ideas were a fantasy. That's surprising to read that from Charles Darwin, isn't it? People are normally taught that Charles Darwin showed us that we don't need the Bible. He showed us that we don't any longer need to think about God creating, because we know how it happened by science. We know that natural selection can make all the designs in the world around us, the trees, the flowers, the birds, the different kinds of animals, without the need for a creator. Well, Charles Darwin had many worries about this. It's not just an argument about science. One of the reasons Charles Darwin worried and had his doubts was because he knew that there were problems with the theory, but also he knew that if people embraced his idea and they began to live without there being a belief in God, it might affect the society. All the people who've written about Charles Darwin, who've written biographies, books about his life, they talk about his illnesses. He struggled with many illnesses. And most of the biographers, most of the people who've written about Charles Darwin, believe that his illnesses were partly because of his worry about how his theory would affect people's lives. They would start living as if there was no God. They would live as they wanted, behave badly. Well, he was right about that. As you look at society in Europe today, in all countries, it is going further away from the Bible because people think Darwin's idea has proven there is no God and no need to trust the Bible. And so there is an important point to be made before we get into some science. If you believe that Adam is your ancestor, created in the image of God, you will live differently, perhaps, than a person who believes they're just an animal. There's no right and wrong. So what do you believe? I'm not asking you what you were brought up to believe or what you're taught in the school. What do you believe? Only you know the answer to that. Well, here's a man of faith. He's an atheist. An atheist has a very great faith. And Richard Dawkins uses the word belief at the beginning of this statement. And he shows that he's a man of faith, because he says, I can believe this, but I can't prove it. When you believe something without being able to prove it, it's called faith. Now, I'm not criticizing Richard Dawkins because he has faith, but if he says he believes something by faith, he cannot claim it is science. And Richard Dawkins is quite well known for saying that Christians are deluded. Has anybody heard of a book that Richard Dawkins published called The God Delusion? It's been published in your language as well. Richard Dawkins' books are often translated into Dutch. And Richard Dawkins said, if you believe in God, if you believe in creation, you are deluded. That means you are a bit crazy. Well, he believes many big things without proof as well. And he attacks God based on his blind faith. He has not visited the whole universe to be able to test it all, to be able to examine it. So if you don't look at the things personally, you can't say that you've done your scientific work. He is a man of faith. The question is not whether someone has faith, but do they have faith in the right things? Do you have the right beliefs, the correct faith? Here's an interesting statement from John's Gospel, chapter 3. And I am a man of faith, but I haven't got the atheist's faith. I've got the faith in the God of the Bible. When Jesus was speaking to a man called Nicodemus, who came to him at night, he was a man who struggled to understand the teaching of the Christian message, and Jesus had this conversation with him. He was a very intelligent man, a man with great knowledge of the Old Testament, but he struggled to understand what Jesus was teaching about the need to be born again and become a Christian. And Jesus said to him, if I have told you about things of the earth, then you struggle to believe that, then you are also going to have a problem with what I'm teaching you about heavenly or spiritual things. Well, I'm a man of faith. I'm committed to faith in the Bible as a Christian. Richard Dawkins, as an atheist, has his own faith. We all believe something. No one believes in nothing. So I ask you, what do you believe? What do your friends believe? What do your family believe? What do the people believe who make the programs that you might see on television? We all have a faith in something. Let's look at some science a moment. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Here is DNA. The idea of evolution in modern times is that mistakes in the DNA create something new and useful. So here you have a very complicated molecule. If you took that molecule of DNA from one cell of your body, it would be about 2 meters long. And the instructions on that DNA are 3,000 million letters, or 3 billion letters. It's like software. It's a coded system for making a human being. If you did the same with an animal or a plant out there, they would also have a software program, but it would be different from yours. All of the creatures in the world have an encyclopedic amount of information, just a huge amount of information. If evolution is true, and we evolved from other creatures which evolved from other creatures, millions of years ago, an ancestor of ours would be a fish, and if you went back further, we came from bacteria or something like that, a cell. You must need new information being added to the DNA over the millions of years to get the complicated life that we see today. How does that information get added to? By mistakes. That's the idea. That's the theory. Well, do mistakes in the DNA help evolution along? Do they help create new kinds of animals and plants? It is information, And I'm not making this up. I just want to show you Richard Dawkins and writing about this, because some people say information, that's just something creationists say. No, here's one of the world's most famous atheists who believes in evolution, who's written lots of books about evolution, and he says it is digitally coded information. And it's extremely complicated, very detailed. So it is information. How do you get all this information without a mind? The information in the software of an operating system like Windows didn't write itself. It had to come from intelligent minds. I hope you think that's true. Where did it come from? I want you to think about just how much information we're talking about. In Microsoft Windows, there are millions of lines of code. But that is nothing compared to DNA. If you took a pinhead of DNA, hollowed it out, took away all the metal, and packed that pinhead with DNA, how much information would you have? Imagine you put that into paperback books, ordinary sized paperback books with text on every page. How many books would you need? How big would the pile need to be? For just to be equivalent, to be the same as one pinhead of DNA. The answer is you would need a pile stretching from here to the moon 500 times. Or a pile of terabyte hard disks 80 kilometers high. You can see these kinds of calculations done by many different people, evolutionists as well, and they are different. You get different numbers, but it's a lot of information. That's the point. It's a lot of information. Did it really come about by writing itself without any mind or intelligence, just by accidents over millions of years? What's this? Does anybody want to guess what this is? Feel free. Have a go.
Hair.
Sorry?
Hair.
It's not hair. Good try.
Wool?
Not wool. It's an animal.
Dog.
They're feathers that have gone wrong. Feathers that have mutated. It's actually from a budgie, or a parakeet, I think you say. If it has a mistake, just one tiny mistake in the DNA, one mutation that makes the information that makes the feathers goes wrong, and you have what we call in English a feather duster budgie. Not that you would use the animal to clean up, that would be very cruel, but you have the idea. So this mutation is not very useful. It's a funny example, but the idea of evolution, the modern idea of evolution, says that a mistake in the DNA occasionally is useful. So this mistake was very bad, it wouldn't survive in the wild, and all the mistakes we see in living things are usually very bad. Often the creature dies before it's even reached adulthood, or it has a disease, or it's got a physical problem, maybe it's deformed. Those aren't good, but they say just very occasionally there might be a mistake in the DNA that adds something useful that wasn't there before. But we know as a fact of biology that there has never been a demonstration of a mutation that made a new protein. Definitely not a new organ or an organ system or a new organism, a new animal or plant. Here is another mutation, or this is the result of the mutation. This is an actual example of a lamb born with an extra leg. It's not useful to it because it doesn't have the right muscles to move it. It's just floppy. It just moves around like that. What's happened is the information for making a leg has been duplicated. It's like taking a piece of paper, putting it on the photocopier, and making a copy of it. But in this case, although the leg was copied, the information in the DNA for making a leg was copied, it didn't make, there was no way of connecting that leg properly to the bone structure of the animal, and no way of putting the muscles there to make it move. So it's useless. An animal like this will die in the wild immediately after birth. So mutations are almost always very bad. And even the ones which you could say might be useful, they spoil the information you've got. I used to teach biology in school, and I've seen this exact example in textbooks in England. I hope you don't have this example in the UK, in Netherlands. But the example of a useful mutation is one that makes the legs of the sheep shorter. Now, I want you to concentrate on this. It's very, very challenging. I'm joking, it's not challenging at all. A mutation, a mistake, makes short-legged sheep. And they said, it's a really useful mutation because the farmers don't have to spend so much money. They can build shorter fences to keep the sheep in. The sheep with short legs can't jump so high, so they don't have to spend so much money building big fences. Does that make you think, wow, evolution must be true? It tells me that they are desperate, because if that is an example of evolution in action, we have nothing to fear. A mutation that makes short-legged sheep in the wild will be exactly the opposite of useful. It will be running more slowly and less able to escape from an animal that wants to eat it. Yes? If you've got shorter legs, you can't run so fast, and if an animal sees you and thinks, I want to eat you, you can't run away so quickly. So this is not useful to the sheep. It might be useful to the farmer, but it's certainly not useful to the sheep. And when we're thinking about evolution, it must be useful to the sheep. That's an example used in a textbook in England. Mutations are not helpful. They spoil information. They don't create it. But we must have an explanation for information in DNA if it's to be a true theory. Is evolution a belief or is it a fact? If it's a fact, we must have a way of explaining where this information in DNA came from. This man is an evolutionary believer. He's a physicist, but he writes a lot about evolution. And Professor Davies says that information must come from somewhere, but we don't know where it comes from. Okay? If you're going to go back far enough in time, you've just got atoms. Atoms must become molecules. Molecules must become cells. And cells have to develop into all of the complicated living things we see around us. But there's no law scientifically that can create information from nothing. It has to come from an intelligence. Now, as a Christian, I believe that the information was created by God. If I had a piece of paper here, white paper, and I took some ink and poured it onto the paper, you would have atoms or molecules of paper and atoms or molecules of ink. Yes? But if I took another piece of paper, just the same, and took a pen, dipped it into some ink, and wrote on the paper something as a message to you, what would you have? Well, if you look at them from the point of view of atoms and molecules, both of them have atoms of ink and atoms of paper making up the paper. Yes? What's the difference? One of them has information on it, the one with writing. The only difference is someone with a mind has written a message in the ink. Information is something different from the stuff that the world is made of. When God created the world, he created information, not just the physical stuff that the world is made of. That's the only way you can have information in the world. Information in things that we make comes from our intelligence. And I believe information in the world around us comes from the God, the Creator. The Bible even calls Jesus the Word of God. So you could say, in the beginning was information in Christ, in the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, what about fossils? Let's think about that for a moment. Some people say fossils support belief in evolution. Fossils are evidence for evolution. Well, I want to ask you that question. Do fossils take millions of years to form? Are they proof that the world must be millions of years old? Here are some pictures of fossils, and at the top left you can see some animals that were swimming once upon a time, and you can see the outlines of even the skin, so you can see the fins, you can see the tail, and these would be a bit like dolphins if they were alive today. You can see these kinds of fossils in, I think, Leiden Museum, and I think one in Haarlem also. On the right hand side you've got a fossil leaf. At the bottom left you've got a fossil horseshoe crab. On the bottom right you've got a sea urchin, a heart urchin. Now all of these animals are well preserved. So when you see something like, you see fossils like this, you should be asking yourself, how can you get something like this so well preserved? I think the answer is they must be buried quickly. But are they evidence for some kind of evolution happening in the past? Well, I can only give you a little bit of information in the time we have, but I want you to remember something. They don't come with labels attached, telling you how old they are when you dig them out of the ground. Fossils exist in the present. We cannot hold a fossil if it's something that is still in the past. It's because it's existing now, in the present day, that we can hold it. So we have to imagine what we think happened in the past, how long ago this creature lived, what it ate, how it behaved. We cannot know that for sure. The age we give it, whether it's in millions of years or thousands of years, is a belief. We cannot measure the age of any fossil by its radioactivity, because the fossils are found in rocks laid down by water, which has no radioactivity. Limestone, mudstone, sandstone doesn't have radioactive stuff in it. You have to use an igneous rock, something that's come out of a volcano, to find radioactivity. So the fossils are given ages of millions of years if a person believes in evolution from other reasoning, not from directly dating it with a method like uranium-lead dating. Okay, they do not use carbon dating to work out ages in millions of years for dinosaur bones. Absolutely never. Never ever. That's what some people seem to think, but it's not the case. So the actual facts, the actual evidence scientifically is the bone. We can see that, we can measure it, we can look at its colour, its size, its shape, but the age, that depends on what we believe about history. Here is a fossil of, so that's an interpretation. The age is based on our ideas about history. Here's an actual fossil of a leaf compared to the living plant's leaf. It's exactly the same. So the one that's alive today is called a living fossil. The one that you see here is similar. It's a fish as a fossil and a fish as a living creature underneath. We call that a living fossil. This is a horseshoe crab fossil, and this is the same horseshoe crabs alive today. This is a fossil insect in tree resin, and this is the actual insect alive today. In all of these cases, there's no real difference between the fossil and the living creature. This suggests that there has been no evolution, no change. We also see fossils which show things are very well preserved. Here's a ichthyosaur, a kind of extinct reptile that swam in the sea, in the middle of giving birth to its young. Another fish in the middle of eating a fish in the middle of eating another fish. They must have been buried very quickly to preserve that kind of thing. Here is some dinosaur skin that's been preserved from a dinosaur found in Queensland in Australia. This sort of thing could only happen if the animal was buried very quickly in some kind of flood. And I think you can probably guess that I believe that probably happened in the flood of Noah that we read about in the Bible. Well, I've only shown you a little bit of information from science, a bit from biology, a bit from geology, the world of fossils. But you and I have to make a decision about what we trust in. Man's ideas about evolution, some of them are quite interesting, but they keep changing. They keep changing. Everything that Charles Darwin learnt was different from what I learnt. The things which are being taught in the universities today are not the same as I was being taught 25 or 30 years ago. Whereas the Bible does not change. And so if you are going to put your faith in something, do you want to put your faith in something that's changing all the time or something that's firm and solid? Richard Dawkins is a man who trusts in scientific ideas about evolution. And you can see from his words here that he is a religious man. The language he's using is not the language of science. Words like beautiful and inspiring and glory and opening our eyes, this is the language of a man who's thinking along religious lines. And indeed, he is a very religious man, even though he's an atheist. Look at his words here. He has reverence for Charles Darwin. It's like he puts him on a pedestal. He says, I think he was a great man. It's almost like he's worshipping him. It's a different religion that he has. Not all people who believe in evolution are religious in this way, but this man certainly seems to be. He believes in evolution strongly because he doesn't want to believe in God. He claims that the evidence of science supports his view, but he admits that he believes it without being able to prove it, as I showed you from his words earlier. Now, I also have faith. I hope you do too. I believe the Bible is true from the very first verse, as these words in Psalm 119, verse 160, tell us. I believe that if you look at this world through an evolutionary set of glasses, you'll be confused. If you believe in evolution over millions of years of death and disease and suffering, if you think that has made our world, you'll be confused. Because the Bible teaches that the world is not the way God made it. It's a perfect world in the beginning, but we live in a sin-cursed world. A world after thousands of years since Adam and Eve fell and rebelled against God in the Garden of Eden. Let me finish with this picture. Death and suffering is an enemy as far as a Christian's concerned, and we look forward to a time when death and suffering is finished. Jesus came to die so that people could be freed from their sin and saved from death, the penalty for sin. That makes total sense from the point of view of Genesis being history. But if evolution is true, you only exist because millions of years of death brought you into existence. If that's true, then there's no need for Jesus to have come into this world and died for sins to save us from death, because death was already here. So there are some very big things to think about. that are much deeper than just the things of biology and the things of science and rocks. So I hope that's useful, and I hope that you will use the websites that I mentioned at the start. Creation.com, which is the website in English mostly, and also the one called www.skeppingovevolutie.nl. Apologies for the mangling of your language a second time. Creation.com and that one there. There's some good books at the back, and especially look at the answers book in Dutch. Now, I've been asked to close your lesson with a word of prayer. Fine. I've been asked to close in prayer. If anybody hasn't got to run for the school bus, I haven't got to rush off. You can look at the literature and you can come and talk to me and ask me a question if you want to. Okay?